You keep telling yourself you're just tired, just busy, just going through a rough patch that will pass on its own. But the tiredness has been here for months, and it isn't the kind that sleep fixes. Most people assume depression looks like crying, like visible collapse, like a person who can't get out of bed. Often it looks like someone still showing up to work, still replying to texts, still functioning while something underneath has gone quiet. Depression isn't one condition with one cause. It's a cluster of related experiences that can arrive through very different doors, and knowing which door matters because it changes what actually helps. Major depressive episodes often arrive in a single identifiable wave, sometimes triggered by loss, illness, or a stressful life event, sometimes with no clear trigger at all. Persistent depressive disorder works differently, settling in as a low-grade heaviness that lasts for years, mild enough that a person can mistake it for their personality rather than a condition. Then there's the situational kind, a reactive dip tied to a specific circumstance, which tends to lift as that circumstance changes. The old explanation for all of this was a chemical imbalance, a simple deficit to correct. Psychiatrist and researcher Ronald Duman helped show something closer to a stress-driven change in the brain's ability to grow new neural connections, particularly in the hippocampus, rather than a single missing chemical. Depression looks less like a leak to plug and more like a system that has downshifted under sustained pressure. Evolutionary psychologist Paul Andrews has argued that some depressive states may function as a kind of forced analytical mode, a shutdown of ordinary motivation that redirects mental energy toward turning a problem over and over. It's an unproven hypothesis, but it reframes low mood as a response with a shape, not simply a malfunction. None of this explains why depression so often goes unnoticed in yourself or in people close to you. It doesn't always subtract energy from every part of life at once. A person can lose interest in the things that once meant something while still performing every visible function that keeps a life running. Routine itself becomes a kind of coping mechanism, a way of holding a life together that quietly conceals how much has drained out of it. The signs worth watching for are quieter than sadness, a persistent flatness where things that used to matter simply stop registering. Irritability that arrives faster than it used to, over things that never bothered you before. Sleep that no longer restores you, no matter how much of it you get. A kind of low hum of dread about ordinary tasks that used to be neutral. None of these announce themselves the way sadness does. They accumulate. Recognizing this in yourself starts with a specific question, not a general one. Is this new, and has it lasted more than 2 weeks? A bad week is not the same signal as a flatness that hasn't lifted in 2 months. The second one deserves attention, the first doesn't necessarily need. Once you've noticed it, the most useful first move isn't a mood shift, it's behavioral activation, a well-studied approach built on a simple mechanism. Motivation tends to follow action rather than precede it. Waiting to feel like doing something before doing it keeps the loop closed. Psychologist Peter Lewinson's early work on this showed that scheduling small, specific activities, even ones you don't expect to enjoy, can start to reopen that loop from the outside. The task doesn't need to be large. A 10-minute walk counts. Cooking one meal counts. The point isn't the size of the task, it's that you scheduled it in advance rather than waiting to feel ready, because the readiness is often the thing depression withholds until after the action, not before it. Sleep and light exposure are a second lever, one people underestimate because it sounds too basic to matter. Depression and disrupted circadian rhythm feed each other, each one making the other worse, and morning light exposure, even 10 to 15 minutes near a window shortly after waking, has research behind it as a way to help stabilize that rhythm. Pair this with a consistent wake time rather than a consistent bedtime. Bedtimes drift naturally when sleep is already disturbed, but an anchored wake time gives the body's internal clock something stable to organize itself around. This isn't a cure, it's a lever that makes the other work slightly more possible. Social contact is a third lever, and it works directly against the pull of the condition itself, because withdrawal is usually the first instinct depression produces. The instinct says isolation will conserve energy. In practice, it removes one of the few reliable mood regulators available to you. Low-effort contact still counts, and it should be treated as sufficient rather than dismissed as too small to matter. A short message to one person, a shared meal, a phone call you don't feel like making. Choose contact that asks little of you rather than waiting for the energy to seek out something bigger, because that energy is often exactly what's missing right now. A fourth lever is worth adding: physical movement, kept deliberately separate from any pressure to exercise for fitness or appearance. Psychiatrist James Blumenthal's research compared structured aerobic activity to standard treatment and found comparable improvement for many participants over several months. The mechanism matters less than the size of the ask. 20 minutes of brisk walking 3 times a week is a specific and achievable target, not an aspiration to reach once you feel more like yourself. Naming the experience precisely, even privately, changes how you relate to it. Not "I'm lazy" or "I'm being dramatic," but "this looks like the low-grade kind that's been building for months." That specific naming does something a vague sense of malaise doesn't. It turns something shapeless into something you can track, act on, and describe accurately if you decide to bring it to a professional. Writing it down, even a single line most evenings, gives you something a memory clouded by low mood can't reliably provide: an honest record of whether the pattern is lifting, staying flat, or getting worse. Because that's the piece self-help can't replace. These are useful first steps, not a substitute for treatment. A persistent depressive episode, particularly one lasting weeks with no clear improvement despite genuinely trying the steps above, is a reasonable and unremarkable reason to talk to a doctor or therapist. Therapy, and where appropriate, medication, exist because behavioral activation and morning light don't reach every case on their own, and recognizing when you've hit that edge is part of taking the condition seriously, not a sign that the self-help failed. What makes depression hard to catch is that it rarely interrupts your life loud enough to force a reaction. It just quietly lowers the baseline until the lowered version starts to feel normal. The signal isn't crying, it's the version of you that stopped noticing the color had gone out of things you used to reach for without thinking and kept going anyway.